Having now discussed the role of Motown in black pop in the mid-1960s, let's now turn our attention to Soulsville, USA, Stax and Southern Soul. In order to start our discussion, let's take a look at what was happening with Atlantic Records. Atlantic Records is one of the most important labels that we talk about as we talk about the history of rock music. Of course, they're there at the very beginning, even before rock and roll, with releasing records in R&B. They're very important in the first wave of rock and roll, that period between 60 and 64. They're very important there with, you know, Benny King, the Drifters, a lot of those kinds of records. And so Atlantic Records, it's important how they morph. And we're going to talk about what happens with them here in this period in the 60s. And then, of course, as you get into the late 60s and the early 70s, they become one of the labels that signs a lot of the really big rock and roll acts. Led Zeppelin, yes, a lot of those groups signed to Atlantic Records. But for now, what's happening at Atlantic Records is they're starting to make the transition from sweet soul to Southern soul. Sweet soul, remember, is that style characterized, again, like Benny King, the Drifters, acts like that. That's a very kind of elegant, restrained, kind of smooth blending of rhythm and blues music with strings and sometimes Latin beats, that kind of thing. Southern soul, however, is a lot more of an enthusiastic kind of music. It's a little bit more unbuttoned. Its gospel influences are right there on the surface, and so it's seen as maybe a more spontaneous and raw, although the recordings are oftentimes quite refined, most of a raw kind of form. Wexler starts to head in this direction when he produces an artist named Solomon Burke. He's working also with Burt Burns. We've talked about Burt Burns a couple of times at Atlantic there, having a #2 R&B hit in '63 with If You Need Me. That's Solomon Burke. Also a #1 R&B hit in 1965 with Got to Get You Off My Mind. But one thing that Jerry Wexler, one of the guys responsible for Atlantic at this time, starts to find out is that in addition to producing his own artists for Atlantic, they can have pretty good success if they find R&B hits that have been regional hits and license them. We've talked about this idea of licensing hits nationally. So Atlantic could rebrand a song, buy the licensing rights off of one of these smaller labels, and really make something that had been a regional hit into a national hit. And so they started Wexler started looking for these kinds of things, looking for these re-releases as another possible way of bringing out hit records with Atlantic Records. And he starts to get into a relationship with Stax Records from Memphis. Now, Stax was formed in 1960 by Jim Stewart and his sister Estelle Axton. So you've got the Stewart as the ST part of it, and the Axton is the X part of it. You put ST and X together, you get Stax. Based, as I say, in Memphis, Tennessee. They came to be licensed and then distributed by Atlantic Records at that time. That meant a very close business relationship with Jerry Wexler, but also with Tom Dowd, the legendary recording engineer of Atlantic Records, who actually came down to the Stax studios in Memphis and helped them kind of upgrade or rewire some of their recording gear, because Dowd was very concerned about the quality of Atlantic Records, and even if they were going to be using the Stax studio a lot more now because they were developing a closer relationship, he wanted to be sure that the equipment was up to his standard. So when we talk about Stax, our story usually starts with the actual Stax label and the actual Stax studio. But then as the story begins to unfold a little bit more, you'll see that it starts to become more inclusive as well, to include other studios in other parts of the South, even in New York City, as part of a kind of general Southern soul, whether the records were actually recorded in the South or not. It's a kind of a stylistic thing. So people often refer to this as Stax. You'll sometimes see people refer to the label Volt, V-O-L-T. Volt was a kind of a subsidiary label of Stax. The Stax Volt refers to a whole sort of style. More specifically, it can refer to just the artists that were on those labels. So what particularly interests me is not only the music of Southern soul and something that we want to talk about here, but also the parallels between Motown and Stax, because a lot of times the way Motown and Stax are set up is somehow like they're polar opposites from each other. And we talked about this in the introductory video. You know, Motown is characterized sometimes as selling out its blackness for a white audience, and Stax is seen as more authentic because it stays closer to its black roots, gospel, more kind of unbuttoned kind of approach. But what's amazing to me is, for all that difference that people usually find in it, how similar the two labels were in the way that they acted. First of all, it turns out that there was actually devoted songwriters and producers at Stax, although not in the same kind of organized way that Berry Gordy had done. We had Isaac Hayes and David Porter working together as songwriters and producers for the act Sam and Dave. And we also have Steve Cropper, the guitarist in the studio band, working pretty closely with Otis Redding. So there is a sense in which you've got some people writing songs and other people performing. You know, the biggest parallel, of course, is the studio band. We talked about the Funk Brothers with regard to Motown, but with regard to the Stax studio, that is the specific Stax studio in Memphis, we're talking about Booker T and the MGs, and these guys, all four of them, kind of legends in the history of black poppy music. Booker T. Jones on the organ, Steve Cropper on the guitar, Duck Dunn on the bass, and Al Jackson Jr. on the drums. Booker T and the MGs had instrumental hits on their own. Green Onions is maybe the most famous of that. And they were the backing band working with a lot of these Stax groups when they came into the studio. And this was even a looser and more cooperative situation than the one that we saw in Motown, where, you know, a lot of times they would not only be working the tune out with the artist, but they would be sort of writing as they went in a kind of very cooperative kind of environment. Remembering that still at someplace like Atlantic, the norm was to have people come in with charts all written out, and musicians would read the charts just like they did for all intents and purposes back in the big band days, back in the 40s and into the 1950s. Also, when we talk about Stax, we have to talk about the use of horns. The Stax horns don't appear on all of the records, but they appear on enough of them that the sort of horn band thing that people talk about from the 1960s that was so influential, something that Paul McCartney was thinking about when the Beatles did Got to Get You Into My Life, this sort of like tight rhythmic thing happening with the hip horns. This is sort of this part of the Stax sound, and it's the Stax horns that people often refer to as being responsible for part of that sound. Let's turn our attention now to some of the performers at Stax, and we'll deal with that in the next video.